At this time, we'll have our question and answer portion. Once again, if you have a question, feel free to throw a hand up in the air and we'll run a microphone to you.
Hi, thanks. I'm Sarah Lloyd. I work for the Department of Plant Agro-Ecosystem Sciences, but I also farm Columbia County. Steve, Professor Deller, and Paul, you set it up well for me. When you're looking at the exports, you were talking about cheese. And I'm wondering, like, in your analysis, like, how much of that is whey, which might be a lower value, or dry milk powder versus higher value cheese? And are there trends in what Wisconsin is doing as far as trying to capture higher value and not just get rid of excess product, cheap excess product by overproducing?
I haven't looked at that data recently, so I'm going back in my mind here in terms of what some of the dairy economists were thinking about, Brian Gould and Ed Jesse, is that there is growth in the whey. They're trying to find markets for the whey, but it's still dominated by cheese. So I think that this is where the innovation comes in, is I think we need to start looking at markets, alternative markets, beyond what we're already pretty good at. We're pretty good at exporting cheese. We could do better. Of course, we can always do better, but I think we need to be innovative in terms of looking at some of these alternatives like whey and crops like that. But in terms of the absolute dollar figures, cheese just dominates.
Gentlemen, thank you. Sean Paff, represent several ag clients. Question for you about Canada. The Prime Minister out of Canada has been saying a lot of interesting stuff lately on a whole lot of issues. But we'll stick to agriculture. Canada seems like they're going on the offense and trying to find their own way a little bit outside of the U.S. umbrella. Very simple. You guys are the economists. You can try to figure out what I'm trying to say here. Can Canada survive without a huge reliance on the USA? We've all battled Canada on softwood lumber, and they've ticked us off on dairy and all that kind of stuff. But I'm not saying you're advising the Canadians, but what does that mean for us if Canada starts going a little bit more outside of the U.S. umbrella, if I'm saying that correctly? Thank you.
It depends on the industry that you're talking about. I mean, if you're talking the auto industry, the supply chains are so structurally integrated that the auto industry, the supply chains are so structurally integrated that there's almost like no border there. It's like trade between, southern Wisconsin and northern Illinois. You can't separate the two. In terms of agriculture, we're at risk. I don't think that the trade will ever just completely disappear, but I think what we're going to see is what's happening like with China and Brazil and soybeans. They're essentially going to start looking for other trading partners that they think can be a little bit more dependable. Is it going to be a structural change? Probably not. It depends on how long these tariffs stay in place. It could be that, 2 months from now, the president changes his mind and all the tariffs are gone. And that's the uncertainty. We don't know. But what's happening is our trading partners are essentially saying the U.S. has become undependable. We're going to start looking for other partners. And that's what Canada's been trying to do with China. How this is all going to play out, I wish I knew the answer to that. But if I did, I wouldn't be here. I'd be buying a brand new Ferrari. Paul, you want to try?
I think that's pretty much sums it up. We're so integrated, so many manufacturing parts and inputs for foods move between the borders as though we're moving between states. That's what U.S., Mexico, Canada, that's what it's about, helping that integration. It's hard to, once you start putting these tariffs between them, that's going to create problems. And so I think Canada's just taking a rational approach of finding an alternative in case they need more of it. And that will affect us. Is it permanent? I doubt it, and there will always be some trade of some sort, I think. We're just going to have to, I think we have to rely on personal relationships to push through these things like the political stuff is really what I think I think that's all we have. That, and I mean, because there's other times when we have high exchange rates and things like that. Those are big headwinds sometimes, where it's cost these companies, or I'm sorry, these countries more to buy our stuff because the dollar is strong. We have to push through those with the personal connections.
But the one Wisconsin industry that is really exposed to is the paper industry. I didn't realize until I started digging into some of this data how the trade flow with the Canadian pulp industry and Wisconsin paper making, they're like joined at the hip. And how this is going to play out with the Wisconsin paper industry is a big unknown.
Okay. Pete Harden. First of all, I'd like to thank you both for your data-driven, frank presentations. So my question goes back to Canada. In 2024, Canada was the leading export destination for United States butter, cream, and anhydrous milk fat, taking 61% of our total milk fat exports. So my question is, if we get into a scenario where there are additional humongous tariffs placed on Canada, are the core products covered under the U.S., Mexico, Canada trade agreement free from these additional tariffs or not?
No, they're not. And that's part of the problem and part of the uncertainty is that the current administration is basically taking traditional trade policies, trade agreements, like NAFTA, or what's the new name for NAFTA?
USMCA.
Thank you. And is completely ignoring them. And that's where a lot of the frustration is coming into play. So right now, no, there's no protection. It could change tomorrow morning.
My concern is ag just isn't as important relative to these political issues they're fighting about, and they're pushing those, and we don't have enough zeros behind agriculture in terms of billions. We need to get up to the hundreds of billions of dollars, or even the trillions, to start mattering. And so their solution in the short term has been to help us with subsidies on the crop side, and that solves the short-term problem. I'm more concerned about the long term of worrying about how these affect our costs and our incentives to innovate and come up with new products, how to keep our costs down, because it's a global competition. Brazil is the world's largest soybean producer. Their yields are the same as ours. They're the largest beef producer now, is my understanding. These are things we used to dominate. The rest of the world's catching up, and these, like I said, I'm worried agriculture isn't as important as it was 20 years ago in this big grand political arena. And so we're having a harder time getting our concerns addressed. That's my concern. And trade is just one of them.
And the thing with Brazil is that Brazil, in terms of its ability to produce, was way up there. Brazil's problem is that they couldn't ship it. They didn't have the transportation system. And what did China do? China came in and invested billions and built out the transportation system. So now Brazil can compete with us head on. There is no transportation bottleneck because China made a conscious decision to invest in Brazil. So if I'm China and I'm looking at needing to buy soybeans, where am I going to go?
Brad Piet, I'm with the Watco Company. We operate railroads here in the state. So this was a thing in the first Trump administration. It seems we have an isolationist trade policy. And with this isolationist trade policy, my concern is that there's going to be less trade, less economic activity. And if this continues to be the push, is that what we're going to be seeing in our economies? Less economic activity, less crops, less producing, less production. And then I guess a follow-up to that is, where's the disconnect with policymakers and reality of economics?
I'll take it. Yeah, thanks. No, this is back to my comment. We just don't have enough zeros. And to be frank, I mean, we export roughly half of our soybeans either directly or as meal and oil and stuff. Corn is somewhere around 20%. Dairy, I think it's somewhere 15 to 20%. If we can't export our surplus and we have to use all that domestically, we can't eat it. We can't use it all. I mean, it's just, we'd have to really change how we use these commodities. We're going to see fewer acres, and our shipping needs for moving grain around on the railroads in the Mississippi River are going to change dramatically. I think it's back to that point I made. This administration, this Congress has political goals, and I think agriculture is more of a collateral damage, and they're willing to help because agriculture still has political clout, but these are bigger issues they're dealing with, and we just don't have enough zeros. If we were talking trillions of dollars instead of tens of billions, they might be more relevant. But they are willing to trade off on immigration policy. They're willing to trade off on these. Why are they pushing these tariffs for political purposes on geopolitics? We're not as relevant in terms of they're willing to trade off and have agriculture lose, provide some payments, and pursue these other goals. And that's a political decision. That's not an economic decision.
You may have heard the phrase that you put 10 economists in a room and you ask them a question, you're going to get 20 different answers. If you talk about trade, and particularly in terms of like using tariffs to protect industries, you ask those 10 economists and 9 of them will agree that's bad policy. It doesn't work. And that the academic research goes back decades looking at that. Particularly after World War II, it's a very popular policy with a lot of developing countries. We're going to put tariffs up and trade barriers up to protect our own industries. It basically backfired, and it really hurt those industries. Free trade essentially has caused a lot of the global growth that we've been experiencing. Free trade has kind of led into a lot of that. Now, we can talk about winners and losers. There's a rising tide rise all boats. I mean, we can talk about that. But this is one thing that economists will agree upon, Paul, you may disagree, is that the policy directions that we're going in terms of international trade is not the right way to go.
If you're measuring everything in dollars, that's what you get. But there's generating those dollars from international globalization. That's been the pushback. It's changed rural communities. It's changed urban communities, and that's the issue. It increases GDP for everybody, but there's a cost to increasing GDP. So we have to change. We have to compete globally. And so sometimes we're good at something, and now we compete globally. Oh, we've got a long tradition of doing this, but now it's no longer relevant because other people can do it better in the world. I have to go do something else. It's like showing up at your office when you're 40 and say, Paul, guess what? You got to go do something new now. You've been really good at being a professor, but now you got to go do something new. That's a cost. But if overall GDP goes up, we say that's where the economists say that's okay. But there are individuals that are forced to change by the economics, and I think that's where you get into political versus economic. Economic decision is obvious. Trade is better.
Yes.
And that's what we're seeing, this debate about the politics of some of these things. And that's the question. Are these costs we're seeing economically worth the political gains? That's why we vote on these things and have policy discussions. I can't answer that question. That's a political question, not an economic question. I don't know what the time.
Michael Slattery, my wife and I farm in Manitowoc County, and my question or comments are more directed to Professor Deller. What concerns me is the leadership, okay? So in 47 with the GATT and the 90s with the WTO, the U.S. was a leader in determining the terms of trade as well as the practices and customs that increasingly countries bought into and we had, all right? With the TPP, we began to pull back on it. So, I mean, what happened with that? Japan and South Korea, where we were their main trade partners, we no longer are. China is, okay? So we are losing leadership, and it's the relationship issue that concerns me because we are losing the leadership, even though I didn't necessarily agree with it. When you lose the leadership, you don't determine the terms of trade, which is what China is now stepping into, and I'm not anti-China, okay? But how are we going to compete? We cannot compete, with this instability that we have going. Furthermore, I mean, I'm a grain and vegetable farmer now. I'm no longer beef, but a metric ton of soybeans out of the port of Sao Paulo is $480 a metric ton, whereas out of the port of New Orleans is $550 to $560. We got a tariff on, and then China slapped a further tariff on. We can't compete. So China turned around and they got Argentina to drop their export tax on soybeans, and they took 100 freight loads of soybeans. So we are losing our competitive advantage in markets if we had a competitive advantage. And how do you see this going forward? I mean, this concerns me greatly. I mean, Canada now has linked China with the Mercosur and with the EU, so we're losing our traditional markets, and we're overproducing everything. And if we do not have these export markets, we're in bad shape.
There was, and this is where it gets to be a bit of a challenge, because there's a piece in The Economist a couple of days ago, and it was more of an editorial. So you got to kind of take these things with a grain of salt, because it's more of an opinion piece. But the point that was being raised is that China is basically, if your major competitor is self-destructing, what do? You just sit back and wait. And then you can be in a position to pick up the pieces and become the leader. So what this editorial was basically saying, or opinion piece was basically saying, is that China is basically sitting back and saying, they see if this continues down this path, that China could become the leader that we have been ever since World War II. Now, is that the sky's falling? I hope not, but it's a major cause for concern.